Guys, these are your first set of video notes for the worm unit. So we're going to take a look in this video at phylum Platyhelminthes, also known as the flatworms. So here's just a look at the diversity of worms. So there's 3 different phyla that we're going to look at. So this video will focus on this section here, the flatworms, and there are parasitic and free-living versions that we'll discuss. So first, some general characteristics. So flatworms are just that, they're flat. They're also triploblastic and they're acoelomate, so they don't have that coelom that very well-developed vertebrates like us have. They're bilaterally symmetrical. They are unsegmented. So when you think of worms, I'm sure you typically think of an earthworm and they have segments. These worms do not have segments. They also have a brain in the form of a cerebral ganglion, and they have longitudinal nerve cords, so they do have some form of a sensory system. They also have something called protonephridia, which are excretory structures or waste, and they're hermaphroditic. So here's just a look at the body plan. So you can see here is pointing to the digestive cavity in the middle. They have the ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm, and then they also have cilia that helps in movement. So they have parenchyma tissue, which is just that loose tissue from the mesoderm. And then they have those gastrodermal cells that comprise that digestive cavity. So they don't have a very well-developed digestive cavity, but they do have one. And like it says, they secrete enzymes. This helps with digestion. Every organism that has some sort of digestion system does have enzymes to help with that breakdown of food. So digestion and excretion. So the mouth is on the anterior end or mid-body on the ventral surface. It depends on the species. Flatworms are planaria and tapeworms are the 2 most common ones that we tend to think about, and those do have very different mouth locations. Their excretory system also contains something called flame cells. Now, flame cells collect all that excess water and nitrogen, and they excrete it through pores on the body. So that's kind of where some of that excess waste exits the body. So their nervous system is also different depending on the type of worm. So a free-living species has a very well-developed sensory system, but parasitic species do not. Why do you think this is true? Well, parasitic species usually live in a host. So because of that, they don't need to have very well-developed sensory systems because they're not really too concerned about predators when they're already inside of their host. So exchanges with the environment. So they do something called diffusion. This is how they exchange gases, and it's also how they get rid of waste. And those protonephridia, which are those excretory structures that we talked about, they run the entire length of the body. And they branch into those flame cells, and this is what gets rid of that fluid and moves it outside of the body. And nephridiopores are those excretory pores where it exits the body. So reproduction. So almost all of the species are simultaneous hermaphrodites. Parasitic species, on the other hand, have a more complex life cycle, and they can have different hosts and different larval stages. And they're also really well known for their regeneration abilities. So planaria specifically, you can do labs with planaria, and you can actually like cut their heads in half, and they'll regrow 2 separate planaria heads. So when they want to do asexual reproduction, they do something called transverse fission. They literally split themselves, and they make another one. When they do sexual reproduction, on the other hand, they release sperm, and then fertilized eggs are then released, and those develop directly into flatworms. So the sperm gets released, they take up the sperm, it fertilizes an egg, those are released, and that's how your larvae are developed. And actually, it's interesting, flatworms do something called penis fencing, and I'll show you a video of that in class, but it's pretty cool how they do that, but kind of weird at the same time. So their regeneration abilities, so this graphic kind of shows you the different ways in which they can regenerate. So here, this is one version. So if you were to cut this little guy into all these pieces here, here, and here, you would get all these different flatworms that could eventually develop. And then I had mentioned about splitting the head in half. If you do that with this guy here, we cut him down the middle, you eventually are going to get a flatworm with 2 heads. So there is a little bit of diversity, like we talked about within the flatworms. So there's 4 different classes that we'll focus on. So here's just a summary in terms of the breakdown within the flatworms, how those are all distributed. So digenans and other trematodes make up over 50% of the flatworms. But then you also have Turbellaria, Cestota, and Monogenea, which we'll discuss. So first up, Turbellaria. So these are mostly free-living. They're tiny, they're inconspicuous, they usually live in water, they're predators and they're scavengers, and the most well-known is this cute little guy known as the Planaria. So these are the most common ones you see when you talk about Turbellaria. So some of their lifestyle things. So they're named for the turbulence they cause. They have cilia, which are little hairs, and they beat them as they move, and that causes the turbulence or turbellaria. And they glide. This is just how they move, and they're usually, like I said, in water. They do secrete a mucus, which aids in the adhesion and it helps them gain traction as well. And they're mostly benthic, meaning bottom dwellers. So they live in the bottoms of little lakes and ponds and creeks and things like that. And they do have several nerve cores with that centralized ganglia or brain. So some species also have a protrusible pharynx, and this is how they capture food and transfer it to the mouth. So if you see this here, it starts here, and they can actually stick it out and help get food and bring it back in. So in terms of parasitic worm environments, there's a couple terms we need to talk about in terms of hosts. So there's something called a primary host. Most of you are probably familiar with this. You've heard stories about this. You have pets that have had this. So it's an animal host where the adult feeds and reproduces. But there's also something called an intermediate host, and this is where the larval form lives and feeds. And we'll talk about some examples of this in a minute. So moving on to the parasites, so class Cestoidea, these are your tapeworms. So most of you know what a tapeworm is. If you don't, I'll show you in just a second. So they have very defining characteristics. They have something called a scolex, which has these hooks, which is how they attach to their host. And they have proglottids, which are all these little units that repeat down their body, which gives them the look of little segments. So let's take a look at this video really quick. All right, so here's a look at some tapeworms within the body.
Start of the small intestine. And we can just about see, this is the first glimpse.
There you go. See, those are all those proglottids we talked about.
1 and 2 meters in length. You can see how closely the worm is associated with the intestine. We have the wall of the intestine closing in around the worm, so very tightly adhered to it. The segments themselves increase in size as we move down the length of the worm. So this is still quite near the front end because these segments are quite shallow. Okay, I think we can see some much bigger segments here. This is further down the length of that worm, getting towards the back end of it. The segments get bigger, they get more.
As you can see, pretty gross, huh? All right, don't mind those transitions there. So as we look at some pictures, you can see those are the hooks where they hook into the body. Then they also have sucker discs that help them suck on to where they're at. And down there's a black and white version of that as well. So those proglottids, so each one can actually have 3,000 to 4,000 in their body. And as a result, they have a massive reproductive output. So parasites, of course, they have to be able to reproduce and make lots of themselves. So this really, really helps them in that survival. And each animal actually has several ovaries and over 1,000 testes. So you can only imagine how many eggs and sperm are being released from one animal. So this is a look at a beef tapeworm, just kind of a couple more pictures for you. And then this is a look at the reproduction cycle. So as you can see, those eggs can be in livestock, and then they hatch, infect the tissues, then they're in that muscle tissue, and then if you don't cook your food all the way, guess what? You're eating tapeworms, not so good. So another class we need to talk about is Trematode. So these are the flukes, and these are also parasitic. All of them, every single one is a parasite, so external or internal parasite, and they have a leech-like body with a sucker at both ends. They also have a gut and a very well-developed reproductive system. Again, they're a parasite. They have to be able to produce lots of themselves, and these are never segmented. So let's look at one of these videos. All right, so this is a picture of a liver fluke from the liver of a human. So this squirmy thing you see, that is the liver fluke. As you can see, it's attached very well. They cannot easily just pull it off. we'll stop there. All right, so those lovely flukes that we just looked at, they do also have a very complex life cycle, and they can have up to 4 different hosts. So this is where that intermediate host comes into play. So there's 2 that are of special concern. So schistosomiasis, that one's so hard to say. It's deadly and prominent in many regions. So it actually bores into your skin, which is pretty gross, and it travels to your circulatory system. So it likes to live in the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, where there's lots of blood, and that's where they grow, and they cause inflammation because those eggs get trapped in the host tissue. So if you see, there's a picture over here of, picture over there of those little boys, and they both have huge bellies because they have tons of worm eggs inside of them. There's also something called the Chinese liver fluke. So this lives in cats, dogs, and humans. It's in your bile duct, and it actually goes through 2 intermediate hosts, and you can get it from eating raw fish. And it's also very common, especially over in Asia, due to the amount of sushi, and sometimes it's not always the best prepared. So here's that fluke reproduction cycle. So you have the larva here, and then it goes into a snail. Well, from there, the snail is going to have the larva that gets released. That's how it gets in the water, which then gets to the humans. And they can live in the veins, like we said, and they're not very big, some of them. Some of them, like the liver one we just saw, are huge. But they do infect you, and they cause problems because they are a parasite. So monogynia is another class. These are monogenetic flukes, and they're named because there's only 1 generation in their life cycle. So AKA 1 egg makes 1 adult. And these are mostly external parasites, something also known as an ectoparasite. And just a couple additional terms you need to know is something called tegument. This is that thickened protective outer layer of worms, and we'll discuss this more in the other types of worms too. And there's also something called the cuticle. So this is a non-cellular protective coating, and it's just found on the outside of worms. And that is all for your flatworms.